Well, hey, friends, welcome back to season 6 of the How People Grow podcast. I'm David Achata. I'll be your host. I am a leadership development consultant and executive coach. I'm a former pastor. I'm a dad. I'm so many things. And so, maybe I'll just stop the introduction there because I just want you to know that I'm glad you're here and I'll be journeying with you for a few months for this next season. I started this podcast to highlight the different ways that people grow and change throughout their lives and feature sometimes interviews, long conversations, monologues. So today I want to introduce season number 6. Season number 6 is going to be about Native practices and Indigenous wisdom. The reason for this is I think that right now where we're at as a culture is there's quite an interest in Native peoples and their practices. I'll tell you about my own personal story with that, but I want to refer to some books and some articles that I've been reading on this subject for a while and just kind of take you on a little journey today. In front of me lies a stack of books with notes. This entire first podcast introductory episode is unscripted. It's just me taking you on a journey through some of the things I've been thinking and reading. And I think we're at a place as a culture where this is important stuff for us to learn from. So that's why I wanted to queue up some interesting interviews for us this season. We have been on pause for a little bit because I've had some other things going on, but I'm happy to say that the interviews are mostly done recording and it's time to start rolling them out. So why are we doing this? I came across an article recently published just a few years back in Time magazine, and it was called "Without Indigenous History, There Is No History" by a man named Ned Blackhawk. I think it was in 2023. And what he talks about in this article is that without Native history, there is no American history. And he talks about in this article how the United States has long minimized Indigenous contributions and perspectives. And so we need to look back and learn from these perspectives so we can shift how we see ourselves and our country. And I would even add in our faith. And I'll get into that in just a minute. This shift right now, I think, to focus on rethinking our long-held assumptions as Americans, is important because we're viewing our identity, our environment, and even our community through, I think, a narrow lens. And I think Indigenous worldviews can offer some alternative explanations and foundations. So, as an example, instead of seeing land simply as a property or a resource, Indigenous traditions emphasize reciprocity with nature, interconnection with other beings, perspectives, people. And so I think we need to learn from this. And so the interesting thing to me as I've been studying this is that there does seem to be a broader effort right now to rediscover a Native presence in American history. And I think there's a renewed interest here because many of us are questioning modern assumptions about what nature is like and for, what our spirituality looks like, how community looks. And so these Native traditions, I think, have a lot of wisdom for us to look at and learn from. So that's why we're going to do what we're going to do. And before I take you on a little journey of the books I've been reading and things I've been thinking about for a few years, I want to just clarify what the word Indigenous even means. And this is a term that has been used in a lot of different ways, but I want to refer to a scholar I've been reading. Her name is Uriah Selidwin. She is an indigenous Nahua and Maya scholar from Chiapas, Mexico. She's also a cultural psychologist, and she works at UC Berkeley, and she's a senior fellow at what's called the Othering and Belonging Institute. And her writings center around indigenous ethics, relationality, and what she calls specifically ethics of belonging. And she wrote a book I read recently called Flourishing Kin, where she unpacks some of this in detail. And what she talks about is that indigenous peoples are those who maintain ancestral, cultural, and spiritual continuity with lands that predate colonization. So in other words, these are peoples who have been connected to lands long before they were ever taken over by the quote Western world and modernized. And so these people that we're going to be interviewing and talking about and talking with for this season are oftentimes people living in non-dominant communities within modern nation states. So I'll be talking to some people who live on reservations within the United States. I'll be talking to people who live within South American countries where there are governments that are more dominant than the indigenous peoples there themselves. So that's a way that we can understand it. But beyond ancestry, indigeneity describes a worldview. And this worldview is about living within a web of relationships. Notice that, okay? Living within a web of relationships, as opposed to our modern idea, which is about individuality. So this season, we're going to be talking about what does it look like to live within a web of relationships with land, ancestors, community, and even, yes, the more than human world. That's going to sound a little spooky to some of you. But that simply means to be thinking about plants, to be thinking about your spiritual beliefs, and to be even thinking about the earth not as property or just dirt that we build on, but as a relative. So we live in this time right now of ecological crisis and social fragmentation. And I think that's why it's important for us to learn from indigenous traditions. And I think that their voices are really going to matter because they still carry long-held practices of stewardship, collective responsibility, and belonging. And these practices offer to us a needed wisdom right now for how we can live more sustainably and relationally in our country and on our planet today. So that's a little background about why we're doing this. So what I want to do for the rest of this introductory podcast is take you on a journey of me digging into my own ancestry and just some of the things I learned along the way. And it's something that I haven't talked a lot about publicly, but as I've been digging into this for years and years now, I thought, let's devote a whole episode to some of what I've been learning about myself and about this worldview over the last, say, 5-6 years. And so the story starts with me as a child. When I was a little boy, my grandfather from Peru would come visit. He came just a few times. It was a very long way away. And but those few visits were very impacting for me. My grandfather didn't speak English. He did speak Spanish, Quechua, and Aymaran. My aunt told me one time that when they were kids, he and their mother, my grandmother, would sneak off into another room and speak in a different dialect, so the kids couldn't understand them. And it was always interesting to me, even as a child, that this is where my ancestors came from, the highlands of Peru. And when I was a little boy, I was aware pretty early on that there had been books written about my grandfather. And I thought that was pretty cool, I think. His name was Francisco Andres Achata. And he was living at the time of some of these books in I think it was the 1930s in the Puno region of Peru, on the outskirts in a small town called Sandia. And what happened was that some Seventh-day Adventist missionaries came to town. And he showed up one night to serenade them with his mandolin and other friends. And I think they were a little bit tipsy, and they sang these missionary songs deep into the night. And these missionaries, I think, had good heads on their shoulders and said, "Hey, let's receive this with grace, and let's make friends." And those missionaries' names were Anna and Bent Larson. Those were common names in my home when I was a child, because these missionaries would become close to my grandfather and to my family. And that's how my grandfather came into the Seventh-day Adventist Church. He was Catholic. And there was a book on my shelf called Tough Times and Tender Hearts, written by Bent Larson. And when I was a kid, I would pull this book off the shelf, and I would look at the picture on the front, and on the front is a man that looks somewhat like my grandfather. It's more of a graphic, but it looks somewhat like him. And it's their story of mission work in Peru. And I would look at the picture of this man on the cover, and he has this cool kind of cowboy-ish, straw-ish hat, and a alpaca wool scarf on. And I knew that this was likely an image based on my grandfather. And I remember thinking as a child, wow, I'm connected to that. That's really interesting. But yet as a child growing up in East Tennessee, I was ridiculed for the way that I looked. I was one of the only brown kids in our town. And I think that at a young age, that caused me to disassociate from that part of my story. And it's not something I consciously did. It's something that I think all of us do. Whenever there's a part of us that is different or is ridiculed for some reason. And it wasn't until many, many years later that I became aware of what I had done. And some of you who have been listening for a while will remember I've talked quite a bit about the chest pain that I've experienced off and on for the last 10 years. Around the time of my mother's death, I began to experience chest pain and other body pains that I'd never had before. Got into counseling, did some grief work, and realized there was a lot of things I'd lost that I'd never really made the time to grieve. So did some of that personal work. That's what led us to leave California at that time, where we were helping start a church, and I was also working with a microchip company. And we moved to Tennessee, where I'm originally from, mostly to get quiet and rest a little bit after I'd been taking care of my mother for about half a year. And we took the time here to kind of rebuild our lives, and we thought it would be a short time, and it's turned into 10 years. Crazy now. Crazy to say that. And fast forward about 7 years after we moved here, the chest pain came back, and it came back in a really strong way. So much so that I had to step away from a lot of the things that I was doing. At the time, I was still involved with helping with church work. I was and am still doing corporate work. And I was just super busy, and I thought it was due to overwork. And so I began to step away from the responsibilities that I had. And as I took time to step away from those responsibilities, what happened was I began to have a little capacity to think about my life and myself and my beliefs. And I got into some therapeutic intensives and got into counseling again, even spiritual direction, which has been very helpful for me. But in one particular therapeutic intensive, one of the facilitators took me aside and said, "David, I hear in your story a big theme of disowning your Peruvian story to fit into the culture that you were raised in. he said, I think there's probably a lot of gold for you there if you'll dig into it. And I had already been digging into it, but I took him at his advice and I dug even deeper. And during that time, I had been just reading up on a history of colonization. And it really originates in something we'll talk about a tad more in our first episode, after this one, our following episode, called the Doctrine of Discovery, which was a papal edict in the 1400s that basically said that we as Europeans have the right to go and conquer non-Christian lands. And if those people become Christian, that's great. If not, we could take their things and kill them and it'll be fine. That's a really simple summary of it. And if you want to dig into it, I recommend a book called Unsettling Truths by Mark Charles and Soon-Chan Roh. And I want to read you just a short snippet from the book, okay? So sometime later, Columbus has come to what is now the United States. And a lot of what's happening in the United States is built on the Doctrine of Discovery. And as I was reading about this, we get to the 1700s, around the time of the Revolutionary War. And we're going to fast forward to the year 1763. And the reason we're going to do this is I want to show you kind of what's baked into the foundation of how we view things as folks in the United States. So I'm going to quote here, okay? And the heading in this section is called A Declaration Motivated by Discovery, meaning this Doctrine of Discovery. And here's what Mark Charles and Soon-Chan Roh write. Through a proclamation in 1763, King George drew a line down the Appalachian Mountains and declared that the colonists no longer had the right of discovery of the Indian lands west of the mountains. Only the crown could thereafter negotiate treaties and buy or sell those lands. This proclamation upset the colonists, who wanted the right of discovery and to lay claims to the, quote, empty Indian lands themselves. Several years later, the irate colonists wrote a letter of protest where they accused the king of, quote, raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. The letter would go on to claim that King George, quote, has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. This stark language reveals an assumption of superiority of one group of people over another group, as well as the self-perception of exceptionalism that would spur the American colonies' desire to expand and extend their influence and presence among the savages, as was ordained and to some extent required by the Doctrine of Discovery. And the colonists signed this letter on July 4th, 1776. I'm going to keep reading just a tad more. While the Declaration of Independence may initially assert that all men are created equal, 30 lines below that assertion, indigenous people are referred to as, quote, merciless Indian savages. The Founding Fathers could use the seemingly inclusive term, all men, because they had a worldview informed by the Doctrine of Discovery that gave them a very narrow definition of who was actually human. I'll stop there. So much in that. And as I began to read this book and think about some of these ideas, it took me back to when I was a kid and I would look at, in our church, what was called Mission Spotlight. And it highlighted mostly the stories of white missionaries going to lands with people with brown or black skin and bringing them, quote, the truth. I remember as a kid looking at these pictures or videos and thinking, all the people in these pictures in movies look like me. And it was kind of confusing. Like, which world do I live in here? Do I live in the world of the white people who are taking the truth, or do I live in the world of the ones who need help in these other countries? And I didn't realize it when I was young, but I was already having a collision of worldviews. Like, where do I belong here? Who am I? What am I connected to? As I began to think about this as an adult later on, I began to have a little clarity. And the clarity was that I live in a country where, in the foundational documents, Native peoples are referred to as savages. And it's interesting, you know, I talk to my friends about this who say, David, I don't see you that way. And on one level, I can appreciate that. That way meaning someone with Native ancestry. And on one level, I appreciate that. There's acceptance there. I have many close friends who don't look like me, as I hope many of us do. But on another level, it is disturbing. Because how can we look at one another and not ask about the things that make us unique? Not be curious, not want to hear one another's stories. And I think that it's not intentional on many of our parts. I think many of us just have a kind of blindness to it, myself included. And so in the years as I've been digging into my own story, I've started to discover some fascinating things. It's too much to tell now, but what I will tell you is, following what that facilitator told me about digging into my Peruvian story, I began to do so, and I discovered some things that brought me a lot of peace that I'd never known before. And as I began to dig into the story of my people in Peru, I just discovered some fascinating things about the world and worldview that I never knew. It really broadened my view of things. And so I want to just, in these last few moments, take you on a lightning fast journey of some of the things I learned. And I want you to see how this is going to inform what we're going to talk about over these next few months in this podcast series. I think this was, maybe 2.5 years back. I picked up a book called The Dance of the Four Winds. I may have mentioned this in this podcast, but I'll mention it again. I picked up a book called The Dance of the Four Winds by Alberto Villoldo. And I'm not a detail guy. I don't read a lot of details. I look at pictures and headings. That's just how I think. And I grabbed this book before I went on a trip with some clients, and I went and sat in a retreat setting in my free time, and I was reading this book. Little did I know, I knew it was a book about Inca beliefs, which would have been the people in Peru. And I was learning about that. I had no idea this was a book about the ancient plant tea called ayahuasca. I'd never heard of ayahuasca. And this book ended up being about that. And it was a real page turner, consequently. But what Villoldo talked about in this book was that these ancient Inca had a belief about journeys people needed to take in their lives. And I've written about this on my Substack page. But it was directional. And the southward journey was the serpent path. And that was where you go to shed your past, like a serpent sheds its skin. To the west, and I'm reading now, is the jaguar path. And the jaguar path is where one goes to lose their fear and face death, so they're no longer afraid of it. In the north is the dragon path, is what he says. I think he's changed it to the hummingbird. But in the book, he talks about it as the dragon path to the north, to discover the wisdom of the ancients and create union with the divine. Finally, he says, there is the path to the east, which is the flight to the sun and the journey to one's own home, to exercise one's vision in the context of one's life and work. And I remember I read this for the first time and thought, now this is interesting. This is a very different way of viewing the world. You've got, in our context, this belief of basically heal from your past, deal with your trauma, live a healthy life, retire one day, and if you're a Christian, go to heaven. And I know that's simplistic, but many of us have worked that path, and it doesn't seem to be giving us the health, the wholeness, healing, the peace that we're looking for. And as I began to look at this, I thought, that's interesting. The northward path, go learn the wisdom of the ancients, or your ancestors' wisdom. The southward, shed your past like a snake sheds its skin. The westward, the jaguar, face what you're afraid of, face death, so no longer afraid of it. And the east is the eagle or the condor. And that's where you would go to gain a vision for your life. And so I read this book and I thought, wow, what if I need to work these four directions? What if I need to learn the wisdom of my ancestors? What am I afraid of that I need to face? What do I need to shed? What really is a vision for my life? And as I began to work these paths, I continued to read. And I came across the work of Randy Woodley, who I've interviewed before, and I will interview again in this season. And this little book, I've read a couple of his books now, but I keep coming back to this one, Indigenous Theology in the Western Worldview. Randy has Cherokee ancestry, and he writes about Native peoples and is a PhD and a retired professor. And in his book, he talks about, in this particular book, he talks about how much there is to learn from these Native peoples, and how when he was doing his research, he traveled for years to many different reservations asking questions. And he shares in the introduction about being at one reservation and listening to one of the Native elders there. And what he says in the introduction there is how they're sitting with this particular man. And I'm reading now, and this man says to them, you know, when I was a younger person, I wanted to find out about what Christians believe. So I enrolled for a semester in this college. It was called Moody Bible College. Have you ever heard of that? And Randy writes, we were surprised and talked about that for some time, but every now and then he would just keep interrupting his own story, which meant he was trying to get a point across. And he said, you know, my uncle told me to never disrespect Jesus because Jesus is a great spirit, and I talked to him. And Randy continues about how listening to this man talk about his uncle. And keep in mind, I'm learning about my ancestry. I'm coming across a man like Randy who's a Christian, who has a Native faith. And it's interesting because I didn't know these things could really mix like that. And I'm asking this question, how do I practice my faith in a way that honors all these parts of who I am? And as I'm reading this introduction, I got something that has stuck with me. And I'm going to continue now. This is page 13 if you want to get the book. He says, and we sat there for maybe 2 hours. And at least 6 or 7 times, he said this thing about his uncle and respecting Jesus. Then at one point he said, my uncle trained most of the spiritual leaders around this area. He lived to be over 100 years old, and my uncle would tell me all these stories about Jesus. So I asked my uncle one time, I said, Uncle, how do you know all this about Jesus? So again, this is a man in this community, a spiritual man who's telling about his uncle who knew all these things about Jesus, who was a Native man. So this man asks his uncle, and I'm reading again, did you go to residential school? Which, for those of you who don't know, was the United States government's partnership with the Catholic Church and other Christian missions to convert Native people to Christianity. So sorry, a little interjection there, but he asked, did you go to residential school? And he said, oh no, I never did that. And then I asked him, well, did a priest teach you? And he says, no, I've never been to church. And then I said, but you tell me all this stuff about Jesus. Have you been reading the Bible? And my uncle said, no. Just remember what I told you in the past. Don't disrespect Jesus because he's a great spirit. And I talked to him. I said to my uncle, well, yeah, you talked to him, but how do you know all these things he's done? And this man says to Randy, I'm reading again. So my uncle looked at me so quizzically and then said, well, when I talk to him, of course, he talks back. And then the elder said, I'm going to pray for you now. And then our time was over. Storytelling ended. I remember reading this thinking, there's something here that's just beyond the categories I have about how Christianity works. Because here's this native man telling about his uncle who had never been to church and never been taught by a priest, but yet he's talking with Jesus and Jesus talks back. Now, at this point, some of you listening who are perhaps my clients in the corporate world may be saying, David, why are you playing here in this world? I thought you worked on leadership. I thought you helped teams understand how to get along and give feedback and how to develop one another. And I do those things. But here's why I'm playing here with us right now and for this podcast season. Because human beings are very complex. And we have histories and stories and beliefs that are driving how we behave and what we believe. And this just happens to be my story. And if my story is this complex, I guarantee there are people on your team and your organization that also have these complex stories. And when you build trust, you do it through asking about their stories. And when you ask about people's stories, it builds engagement, which means people's wanting to be there at their workplace. And I think it was a Covey study that people in engaged workplaces reported something like 200% more energy. So we've got to dig into one another's stories. And people in our workplaces also have varying religious backgrounds. And I get it. At work, we're not bringing that stuff in all the time, but it's there. We've got to know what's there. We've got to ask when appropriate what's there. It builds trust. It builds relationship. We're more than our ability to produce money. We're more than our ability to do the job. We are these complex beings that carry all these things within us. So back to Randy Woodley in this book, and I'm reading this book and I'm thinking, how is it possible that Jesus is talking to this man on a reservation? And, it's something I don't really have an answer for other than it is what it is. We try so hard to slice and dice and explain these things that are just a mystery. And all we can do is acknowledge that it's true. And there are many stories like this that we'll hear throughout this podcast season. Not everybody in this podcast season are from Christian background. So there are people who have more native beliefs. There are a few native people I interview who have Christian backgrounds. Not all the people I'm interviewing are native people, but are more advocates for native people. And but I want you to know as I go in that these are some of the questions and some of the fascinations that I have and have had about the integration of native people's beliefs and the Christian faith. And so as I've been exploring the last couple of years in my reading, I've come across so many great things, and just two more books I'll refer to. I referred to this one a couple months back called Lame Deer, Seeker of Visions. And Lame Deer was a medicine man, and he was interviewed by a man named, what was his name? Richard Rohr. Yeah. And Lame Deer had come to a civil rights march in the 60s and had met Richard Rohr, and they struck up a relationship, and Lame Deer came and he stayed with him for a while. And it's a great book, a real page turner. And what Lame Deer talked about was, he talked about how if you're going to be a good medicine man, you've got to understand normal people, and you've got to understand normal life. And so there's a short section I want to read you from the book because I think it captures the spirit of my own explorations in the last couple of years. I've been a long believer that if God is with me, then I have a lot more stability. I have a lot more wholeness, peace. I have a lot more ability to go curiously into the world rather than a traditional Christian view, I think, is be careful because the world's gonna get you and it's gonna defile you. And I read this in Lame Deer's book. I thought, man, I like this. So he's describing all these different things that he's done and he's tried. And he says, I'm no pishko. And a pishko was a bird that he had described earlier that just drops her eggs anywhere and is kind of careless. So he says, I'm no pishko, but I'm no saint either. And this is page 75, by the way, in his book. He said, a medicine man shouldn't be a saint. And I stopped there for a second because I have so many years under my belt where I've worked with churches, and I worked for 10 years before I started my business as a pastor. And my ears perk up because a pastor, I think, is supposed to be something like a modern day medicine man, a healer, someone with wisdom and knowledge. So I'm perking up here. So he says a medicine man shouldn't be a saint. He should experience and feel all the ups and downs, the despair and the joy, the magic and the reality, the courage and the fear of his people. He should be able to sink as low as a bug or soar as high as an eagle. Unless he can experience both, he is no good as a medicine man. Sickness, jail, poverty, getting drunk. I had to experience all that myself. Sinning makes the world go round. You can't be so stuck up, so inhuman that you want to be pure. Your soul wrapped up in a plastic bag all the time. You have to be God and the devil, both of them. Being a good medicine man means being right in the midst of the turmoil, not shielding yourself from it. It means experiencing life in all its phases. It means not being afraid of cutting up and playing the fool now and then. That's sacred too. Nature, the great spirit, they are not perfect. The world couldn't stand that perfection. The spirit has a good side and a bad side, and sometimes the bad side gives me more knowledge than the good side. And he carries on. It's such a good section. And what captured me about that is his openness to try things and learn. And as I began to just explore with my reading and learn to give my own spiritual practices some changes and some upgrades, I kind of held that, in my back pocket, like it's okay to try some new things. When I stepped away from helping lead my last church, it gave me some space to think about my practices. And through my readings, I've integrated some practices that are more ancient. I spend a lot more time in the quiet now. I spend a lot more time with my breath, with fire, with smoke, with feathers. And for those of you who know me personally, I'm happy to tell you about that if you want. But I've learned these practices from some people who I've connected with, some of whom I've interviewed in my podcast in the past, and some of whom you may meet in this series. And in my digging into the beliefs of my people in Peru and of other Native peoples in North America and even in Canada, what I've seen is that we as a culture have a lot to learn from the art of ceremony, of embodiment, of a connectedness to the earth. And it's in my own personal learning and integration of some of these things into my own life that I've become a lot more peaceful and stable again. And that chest pain I mentioned at the very beginning of this podcast episode, it's not there anymore. And I think that that's important. And I need to pay attention to that. We need to pay attention. I think we in our culture are so up in our heads. And in particular, as it relates to those of us who are Christians, I mean, I don't mean to be rough on anybody, but I think much of what we call faith these days is just spiritual bypassing. What we do is we say, All right, there's a Bible text, just think it and believe it, and everything will be fixed. When really there's a whole lot of stuff that we could learn from that darkness. Or as my season finale guest, John Perkins, would say, the jaguar. It's the one who symbolizes death. The thing that we're scared of, maybe we need to touch it. Maybe we need to listen to it and learn from it. Because maybe it has something to teach us. We don't need to bypass it. Maybe we need to go hang out with it. And so the last book I'll share with you briefly, I've also alluded to in this podcast before, but it's a book by Richard Rohr called What the Mystics Know. And I picked this one up as I was reevaluating my practices. And it's a great book. And I picked it up at a time when I was asking the question, what am I now? How do I relate to my faith? How do I relate to this world, given all the things I'm learning, all the changes I'm going through? And I read this from page 51 of that book. He says, Richard Rohr says, 2 words of Greek origin are important: symbolic and diabolic. Symbolic means to throw together. Diabolic means to throw apart. Evil is always dualistic, always separates body from soul, heart from head, human from divine, masculine from feminine. Whenever we separate, evil comes into the world. Now, there's a lot in that paragraph alone. And I think that we have a lot to learn from that paragraph right now, because we're very dualistic these days in our culture. It's us versus them, good versus bad, all that. Republican and Democrat, the list goes on. Christians versus everybody else. Now, what Richard Rohr continues to write is, people I have known with psychotic or neurotic problems invariably have been emotionally divided. One part of their emotional life is affirmed, another part repressed. Don't think this, don't feel that. Thus, one part of their humanity is denied. We all find a myriad of ways to divide or to separate. And he says, you're not an acceptable person because of your color or religion or race. And he says, whenever we divide, we destroy. Symbolism, however, always reconnects what has been thrown apart. That probably explains why healthy religion, which is religio, it means literally to bind back together. Throughout history, we have symbols, we have images of reconciliation that heal, that put together what has been taken apart. God is always the great reconciler and healer of opposites, even sin and goodness. There's a lot there, but that's my last book I want to share with you. And the reason I wanted to end on that one is I personally have been through a process in the last few years of reconciling what seemed to be opposites, of becoming a whole person instead of a divided person. For years I thought I had to be one way, rather than I just want to be all the ways that I am, because that's who I am. And I hope that as you listen and you think over the season about who you are, you'll also be thinking about, how do I reconcile all the parts of who I am? And as I feature some of the voices over the next few months that I'm going to share with you, my goal is not that you become like the people I'm featuring. My goal is to showcase conversations to make us think about the way we view the world. And how do we reconcile the division that we might feel inside of ourselves? Could it be that the voices of these people have wisdom for us to learn from? And I think absolutely, or else I wouldn't have spent so many months creating these conversations. So as we finish up, I'll give you a brief overview of some of the guests we have, and then we will finish up for today. So thanks for tracking with me. My first episode is going to be coming next week, and it's going to be with 2 gentlemen who are PhDs named Danny Zacharias and Chris Hockletubby. They wrote a book called Reading the Bible on Turtle Island. Turtle Island is meant to refer to North America, and it's about learning to view the Christian faith with a lens of Indigenous people, and that's a fascinating conversation. The rest of the interviews I'm going to tell you at this point are not coming to you in this order, but they're just in the order I'm telling you right now. I'm interviewing another teacher, author, professor named Damien Costello, who's a scholar in the life of Black Elk, who is a Lakota Medicine Man. He's going to talk with us about the role of visions. He's from a Catholic background. I'm going to interview a woman named Francisca Santabanez, and she is I don't know how to describe Francisca's belief system other than that she believes in listening to plants. She is a Brazilian, and she's going to be sharing with us this subject on learning to listen to plants and the spirit of the earth. It's a fascinating conversation. A new friend who is also Peruvian, like me, named Lorena Saavedra Smith. She's written a book called Awakening Your Roots, and our interview is going to be called Reweaving the Broken Soul. It's about wisdom from Pacha philosophy, which is the Peruvian world. I'm going to be interviewing a psychologist, counselor named Stephanie Goins, who's married to a Native man. Stephanie has done research in Sierra Leone with healing of child soldiers. And so she shares some of that, but also about some of her learnings in the last few years about Native peoples and their ways. And she's going to be giving us an overview about what it looks like to walk in a good way. I'm going to be interviewing Randy Woodley again. We're going to be talking a bit about his area of expertise, which is the Harmony Way. Also want to interview him about some other topics, but you'll hear about that later. And then I'm going to interview also a really cool guy who's the son of one of my former clients, Amy Buckingham, who I've interviewed before. His name is Damon Neeson, and he's going to be talking to us about the role of singing and ceremony. He is Pomo and Yuki Indian, and he's going to share with us some of his story, and an amazing young guy. Looking forward to you hearing and learning from him. I may have left somebody out, but I do know that our season finale is John Perkins, who lives out near Seattle. John Perkins is a New York Times bestselling author who wrote a book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman about his time as an economist and involved in the world of hostile financial takeovers. John Perkins nearly lost his life in the 60s when he was working in the Peace Corps in the Ecuador jungle. And a shaman saved him, and it changed his life. And so for our season finale, John Perkins is going to talk with us about this idea about how do you change your dreams. And he's going to be sharing with us lessons he learned from this shaman. So a lot of different people, a lot of different worldviews. And I'm just a listener and a learner on this journey, just like you are. So thank you for being here for the How People Grow podcast. If you're new, go back and check out our other seasons. They're all on different topics. And this one is on what Indigenous wisdom could teach us today. So we'll see you next week for Danny Zacharias and Chris Hockletubby. And they'll be sharing with us about how to decolonize the way that we see. If this conversation has been helpful to you, go on over and check out our Substack page. There's a link in the show notes. You could drop us a couple bucks a month, and you could be in on a monthly conversation where we talk about these subjects. So go over and check that out. All the writing is free. Our music for this season is by Makate Roche, and the song is called Prophecy. So Makate, thank you for allowing us to use your music for this season of the How People Grow podcast. So that's it for now, my friends. Thank you for being here. Thank you for tracking with me. Thank you for being engaged in these ideas. And we will be together again next week.